Um, okay, so welcome everyone to the latest seminar in Art History Cultural Practices research seminar series on cultural recovery. We're recording this evening and we're delighted that we have Professor James Thompson talk to us about his current work and a forthcoming book, I understand it, around care aesthetics. I'm not going to give you much more of an introduction than that, James, because I think you can speak for yourself. So if that's okay with everyone, we'll have around 20-25 minutes of James doing his thing, and then we can move into questions and answers. Okay. All right, so over to you, James. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Abby, and thanks for inviting me to your seminar series. I'm really happy to be here. I'm going to speak about care aesthetics tonight, and in a second I'm going to start reading a piece of work. So apologies that it's not sort of improvisational straight to the screen, but I will be reading something. And I'm sort of drawing on three things. I'm drawing on the sort of background to the work that I've been doing on this idea of care aesthetics. I'll talk a little bit. Some of this will come from the book that I've got coming out in the summer, and then also there's going to be a section about the research project that we've just started in March this year, which is a research project on care aesthetics, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a while. I'm not using, I know I'm speaking to some art historians and I feel really embarrassed about having no visuals, so you can throw things at me later for my absence of any visual aids. So it's just going to be me and my voice, which is already a bit croaky, but so apologies for that. But I'm really happy to take any questions of any nature at the end. So here I go. It's going to be me reading, and I'm just looking at my screen, which I'm reading from. So again, apologies for that. I'm going to start with a prologue, which includes an anecdote, comments on a poem, and comments on a chapter. First, the anecdote. When a friend from the Democratic Republic of the Congo visited me in the UK and was still learning English, he turned to me one day and said, "James, why in England do people put their children in wheelbarrows?" He could not understand why parents pushed their children onto buses, had them facing away from them, nestled in the wheelbarrow, while they busied themselves looking at their phones. My proper response to "why do you put your children in wheelbarrows" was not "those are pushchairs, buggies, strollers, not wheelbarrows," because his choice of words was actually wonderfully telling about a norm of care that deserved to be questioned. He did not ask this question with a sense of superiority, but of genuine concern for both the child, but more particularly for the relations we were developing with our offspring. Asking questions about the way we care reveals dynamics that are often unnoticed. Care is not a fixed, unchanging, or culturally static practice, but shifts in response to different contexts, cultures, and times. Any analysis of care must acknowledge that it is always embedded in certain cultural norms and expectations. My friend revealed the importance of seeing care from different cultural perspectives, but also his gentle admonishment illustrated that commenting on the practices of care can also be a critical act. We do put our children in wheelbarrows that face away from their parents. We need to reflect on what this both says about our society, but also, more importantly, what it creates. What relations are produced and reproduced in this process. Care is important because attention to the quality of care is a powerful means for critiquing the way our human-to-human relations are practiced. Saying care is beautiful or ugly is, of course, only a partial interpretation dependent on the context one comes from. I might be describing pushchairs, others might see wheelbarrows. A poem. Roger Robinson is a poet who lives and works between London and Trinidad. His poetry collection, A Portable Paradise, won the 2020 T.S. Eliot Prize. It is both affirming about the endurance of a Black British experience, a blast against the iniquities of events like the Grenfell Tower disaster, and a moving account of moments of care. His poem Grace in the collection has been called by him in public readings a love letter to the NHS and its nurses. And it tells the story of the care for his premature son by a particular Jamaican nurse. These are the final two stanzas. Another consultant tells the nurses to stop feeding a baby who will soon die. And she commands her loyal nurses to feed him. No baby must dead with a hungry belly. And she'd sit in the dark, rocking that well-fed baby, held to her bosom, slowly humming the melody of Happy by Pharrell. And I think, if by some chance I'm not here and my son's life should flicker, then Grace, she should be the one. Grace is a poem about care, but it's also an artwork about the art of care. Grace holds, rocks, and sings. The poem is quietly noting and celebrating the aesthetics of her caring practice. She demonstrates an attention to her charge, a precision of movement, and shows her profound understanding of the intimate relation between music and comfort. She does not add bodily movement and music on top of her care for the infant. They are integrated parts of it. Importantly, this type of care is done in spite of a demand to the contrary. Grace refuses the instruction of the consultant and commands her nurses to do exactly the opposite. Good care, as a practice, is often resistant. Quality care can compete with norms that push in an opposite direction. Virtuoso examples of care point at the inadequacies and cruelties that exist in many contexts. Robinson describes Grace as a Jamaican senior nurse, and it's important to note that care can never be detached from the specifics of the life experiences of its practitioners. We cannot separate the caring practices of the NHS from the patterns of migration that have forged it and the cultures of care that many different communities brought to it. Care is shaped at a minimum by differences in race, gender, and class, and it is vital we understand the subtle differences brought by diverse communities. Care is often a set of practices that are undervalued because of failures to recognise those people who undertake care and support others. We need to shine a firm light on those practices of exceptional virtuosity so often overlooked in many contemporary accounts of professional care and professional arts. We need to assert the significance and importance of the astounding aesthetic experience created by carers who are often poorly paid, rarely acknowledged, and too often sidelined in hierarchies of value linked to types of formal and informal labour. We need to capture and champion how care will feed babies in spite of the orders of others, and do it with a warm hold and a song of happiness. Care is poorly distributed, rewarded, and valued, but poems such as Grace are part of a project to bring recognition to the astounding craft by which it is often executed. A chapter. In 2020, the Boston Review brought out the collection called The Politics of Care from COVID-19 to Black Lives Matter, edited by Deborah Chasman and Joshua Cohen. It makes the argument that the greatest social crisis of a generation, which we're currently living through, needs, in their words, a new kind of politics, and that is a politics of care. One chapter is written by activist and former editor of Boston's Gay Community News, Amy Hoffman. I choose this chapter, poignantly titled "Love One Another or Die," to point to the importance of recognizing the different ways that care is both written about and materializes in people's lives. Hoffman's chapter reflects on the history of the lesbian and gay communities of Boston, their lives affected by a network of bars, meeting places, private parties, and of course the Stonewall riots and oppressive policing. She was features editor of the Gay Community News in 1979, when they put together the Stonewall 10th anniversary edition. Her writing takes us through stories of public campaigning and personal caring, particularly of friends with HIV and AIDS. She documents the movement as it shifted from the lesbian and gay community to the broader LGBTQ+ and queer politics of more recent years. When we focus on today's pandemic and discuss the extraordinary impact it's had on many people, we should not forget that for certain communities, a pandemic and a crisis of care is not a new thing. Hoffman writes that living through today's terrifying pandemic has given her time to reflect on the early days of queer liberation and that other pandemic. That other pandemic. It reminds us that care crises have histories, they have antecedents, and we should learn from them and acknowledge that pandemics bring with them a long history of discrimination and response to that discrimination. Hoffman's account is important because it shifts between a public and private register, demonstrating that the work of caring for friends and caring for a community wove back and forth between each other. The appalling treatment of patients with HIV and AIDS was a public disgrace, but was experienced through the daily practices of intimate care. As Hoffman tells the story of persuading people not to wear gloves when meeting people with AIDS, we see love and care as part of the struggle against homophobia and injustice. And importantly, the look and feel of wearing gloves compared to caring for someone without them produces a different sensation, a different aesthetic of that care. The practice of caring intimately for your friends was, for Hoffman, part of what it was like to live as a community under siege. And gay liberation, for her, was marked by, and I quote, how we rose to the challenge of caring for one another. We therefore need to place ourselves in a tradition which sees care as connected to a broader politics and cannot be relegated to an activity of a disconnected private realm. Who we care for, how we care for them, and what motivates that care cannot be detached from a wider politics that struggles against discrimination and cruelty. The act of care for others and accepting our need to be cared for are part of the way we meet the challenges of different forms of injustice. There have been many pandemics. Indigenous leader Tucumã Kwikuru of the Kwikuru from the Xingu Indigenous Territory of the Amazon region responded to a question about what he thought of the pandemic in the early days of the COVID crisis by asking, which one? Care cannot escape its histories and the terrifying legacies of its absence. So, an anecdote, a poem, and a chapter. For me, explorations of how the arts care, and care has a certain artistry. And this brings me to care aesthetics, the subject of my current research. When I first started working on the idea of care aesthetics, my purpose was to question the boundaries in my area, which is applied theatre, between, on the one hand, the artists who had the capacity for operating in an aesthetic register, and on the other, the social, educational, or health workers who operated in a register of care. I was interested in how artists demonstrated care in their work, whether through attention to actors and participants, focus on objects, involvement of communities, or design of spaces. Similarly, I was interested in when social health or care workers demonstrated an artistry or craft in their work, when they practiced with a certain attention to aesthetics, and what it might mean to critique care practices for their lack of attention to a sensory experience, or when they were executed without an aesthetic sensibility. Care aesthetics was trying to imagine practices which were both caring and aesthetic, without assuming who was automatically entitled to the designation carer or artist. So the physiotherapist could demonstrate care aesthetics in their work with a patient. A neighbour may cook a meal for an isolated friend, which communicated her love and affection for them. A social movement might be structured with a certain care aesthetics in the beautiful way it maintained bonds and support between its activists. Care aesthetics was trying to get away from the idea that applied theatre or socially engaged arts were about places empty of aesthetics, inviting the artists into their midst to invigorate them with joy, play, or craft, with a model instead that suggested there is a care aesthetics in many different parts of our lives. The argument is that we need to sustain our ability to care for each other, for our communities, and for the worlds in which we lived, with great craft and skill, without thinking that only those with the formal title artist could provide this. Of course, artists can and do provide rich care aesthetic experiences, but care aesthetics seeks to democratize who is valued for their aesthetic work and recognize the artistry of multiple practitioners and professionals. This argument is making a demand that in a world of extremes of lack of care and the ugliness of poverty and discrimination, we need to improve the way we live together to ensure the damaging and unequal relations that dominate our worlds have a chance to be transformed. Care aesthetics is about the shape and feel of how we look after each other and how we look out for each other. It's about the art and craft of solidarity. But I'm sort of getting ahead of myself here. So I want to go backwards to where this came from in my work, because up till a few years ago, I only worked on theatre and the arts in conflict zones. So this is clearly a new departure. So this is a story about where this started from. When my friend Antoine Mavugny had an operation on his shattered elbow in 2011, he needed nearly 6 months of physiotherapy during his recuperation. A bullet had entered his forearm and exited through his humerus above his elbow joint. His elbow had been resting out of the window of his van, and this particular shot whizzed along the side, going clean in and out of his arm. In severing the nerve that runs over the tip of his elbow, and his elbow having been rebuilt with a lattice of metal plates, he had lost the feeling and most of the movement in his fingers. It was their gentle manipulation which was the focus of most of his post-operative therapy. When Antoine arrived in the UK, he had very little English, although, as with many people in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, he had at least 5 other languages. His negotiation with his physiotherapist was therefore in a form of broken communication and an intensity of touch and gaze. As she held his hand, he had to hold her in his eyes. One sense was tuned into the other, and as she pressed, twisted, and manipulated the joints, the grip of his stare shifted in strength as it indicated the pain that he was in. At certain points, he would suck deeply on the supply of gas and air, using his uninjured left hand to draw the mask to his face, and then drop it, and then with a nod to his therapist, who would then nod back and continue. There was a pattern of massage on the palm, fingers, and knuckles that used the rhythm of what appeared to be the rolling pain he was in to intensify and ease off in turn. It was a toing and froing that seemed to be a physical dialogue that was attempting to pressure his hand back to life. And the touch, the tenderness, and the eyeball-to-eyeball trust appeared to give him the strength to commit to the process. He nodded and he gave in to her skill. It was executed with the dexterity and attention to detail of a true craftsperson, someone who had an immense knowledge and a capacity to execute it in a way that adapted in response to the person who was in front of her. The quality of the relationship between them, built through touch and facial understanding, changed over the months as they seemed to develop a rhythm of call and response. The object of her craft was not an inanimate thing to be shaped, but a responsive and gradually responding part of Antoine's recovering body. An arm and a hand that would have been lost was returned to a level of function that meant Antoine could return to work back home in the DRC. My wife and I, independently of each other, referred to this relationship as beautiful. And this led to me to develop an inquiry into why we chose to use an aesthetic term for a caring relationship. This in turn led to 3 questions. My previous work on documenting artists in war zones changed, and Antoine's care led me to ask whether we can locate a social justice focused arts practice away from trauma or suffering and start instead from care, from a human capacity. Second question is, if carers or physiotherapists can be artists, how might we learn from them or improve that artistry? And the third question was, what happens if we consider the caring work of artists part of their artistry and not the social outcome or social impact of an otherwise artistic practice? The ambition now is to examine what it means for art to take care seriously and care to accept that it has an aesthetics. Now, of course, this means accepting a certain definition of aesthetics, and many people here will probably completely disagree with me, but this is one that is about embodied experience and sensory practices, not merely about visually centric appreciation or discernment. Traditional approaches to aesthetics have been concerned with subject-object relations, the thing in front of the person. Aesthetics for care aesthetics is claiming that interpersonal relations can have an aesthetics. Of course, this draws on the work of Bourriaud and relational aesthetics. It also draws on the pragmatist aesthetics of people like Richard Schusterman, and then everyday aesthetics of writers like Eureka Saito and many others. Also, it means accepting a certain definition of care. And most of the work in the care aesthetics project that we've been working on draws from feminist care ethics, which says that care is an embodied practice that, while it can be a source of inequality, is also a source of interhuman mutual aid, which we all, at some stage in our lives, have relied upon. Care aesthetics draws on the field of care ethics, particularly the work of Jean Tronto and Maurice Hamilton, just as examples, but we draw on it to make the case for care as a crucial site of contemporary ethics, politics, and then by extension, aesthetic concern. This is the ground, in a sense, of the new AHRC care project. And it's one that seeks to expand the term care aesthetics by drawing on new theories and new disciplinary areas. The Care Aesthetics Research Project is a 3-year project to explore the concept in partnership with people working in health and social care and the arts, exploring a common language for an aesthetics of care and what it might look like in practice and how it might be researched. It includes 4 case studies, primarily focused on older people care, we would contend that this is a preeminent context concerned with embodied relations of care. And the 4 case studies are working with care assistants in a secure dementia ward, undertaking ethnographies of care workers in domestic homes, the creation and documentation of a major arts project in a care home, and then the documentation of community-based care aesthetic responses to the COVID crisis. Finally, we will be creating what we're calling a care aesthetic lab, which is to share, explore, and develop what care aesthetics as a practice might look like. We will be documenting examples of care aesthetics in arts and healthcare practice. So, for example, in the arts, we might look at the practice of intergenerational theatre, where devising processes create relationships that are part of the art making, not just a byproduct of it. In these types of projects, the relationships between young and old are part of what the art makes. The process is not the means to an outcome, but it has an aesthetics of its care. Similarly, community dance, where care between dancers is the aesthetic. The lift and hold have to be both caring and artful for it to be successful. Lifting a person into the air as a practice must be simultaneously a careful and well-crafted practice. In health and social care, we will be drawing on the work that already draws on what we would call an aesthetic register in accounts of different care practices. For example, in many accounts of nursing and healthcare, they already use an aesthetic language. Famously, Florence Nightingale, founder of contemporary British nursing, said that nursing is a fine art. Similarly, in nursing education, they use the expression aesthetic knowing, drawn from the work of Barbara Carper, to explain the sensory, embodied, and spatial practices of carers. By way of example, I'm going to give a description of the work of a nurse in an outpatient clinic from 2 writers on nursing training, and I'll quote what they say about this piece of work. They write about it in the following way. Presley works in the orthopedic clinic of a large urban hospital and uses aesthetic knowing with each young child who comes for cast removal. It is aesthetic knowing that helps him remove the cast in the least distressing way for the child. Presley understands that this child likely sees a large person approaching her leg with an electric cutter and other tools that resemble those in her father's woodworking shop. Presley might use a combination of distraction and humour, as well as careful timing, to move through the required procedure in an artful way. So this account from the work of Chin and Kramer, it includes comments on humour, timing, movement, and technical skill combined. This is not artful nursing as opposed to a technical skills of nursing. It's an integrated, aesthetically attuned practice. It's importantly not about artists working in health settings, but the artistry of existing healthcare practitioners. One ambition of the project is both to map the language of aesthetics that already exists, but also bring it into dialogue with the aesthetic language within the socially engaged arts. So, to end, Care Aesthetics is interested in health practices and socially engaged arts, and how a common language can help each learn from each other. However, it's also not separate from the everyday practices we're all involved in the care we offer each other and all need. The ambition of the research project is to explore what it might mean, what it might look and feel like, and how a more aesthetically attuned version of care might improve people's lives in diverse contexts. The term is not fixed or predetermined, but hopes to grow through the research and the practices we develop as the project unfolds. It's trying to describe pushchairs while others will see wheelbarrows. It seeks to validate the rocking and singing of grace, and it seeks to acknowledge the different communities who have faced the challenge of caring for one another during the histories of different care crises. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. Yeah, thank you. That was marvellous. I'm just...
I've just read a comment. Thank you to the person who's not going to throw anything at me.
So thank you, James. Opening up to questions now. And Costas has already got his hand up. Work away, Costas.
So yes, I'm going to put my hand up as soon as possible because I need to go and pick up my son from the nursery. So I thought I'll actually, in fact, I've written my question in case I wasn't able to ask it, James. But first of all, many thanks for this kind of fascinating talk. And I too am currently looking at museum professionals' work around collecting spontaneous memorials after terrorist attacks and natural disasters, and I'm looking at them through the lens, looking at this practice through the lens of an ethics of care, drawing on Toronto and Virginia held. So in the beginning of your talk, you mentioned about that. Actually, I'm going to read this out. You mentioned the relational nature or cultural, geographical, or temporal contingencies of care and how it can be understood, which might also go against accepted or standardized approaches to care. My question is, when it comes to understanding and developing whole sectors, professional practicing care, for example, the museum sector, practice understanding application of care, how do we ensure that this relational nature of care doesn't become so contingent to each particular context that it becomes impractical to inform broad policies and practices of that sector? That's something I'm currently grappling with when it comes to applying ethics of care, which are very contingent to contexts, specific contexts in museums.
Thank you, Costas. Oh, they're all going to be this difficult questions. It's really, you're absolutely right, Costas, because one of the wonderful things about the care ethics field is that in many ways it's a response to over standardized forms of ethics. So absolutely, it's an ethical sort of philosophy that starts from the importance of contingency and starts from the importance of relations. You know, sort of, if you think about Gilligan, the early work of Gilligan was against the sort of idea, the Kohlberg scale of sort of moral life, to say that the way in her work, in the way women care, you learn from the contingencies of their practice. So I think it would be amiss if you lost that sense of contingency and you realize that each place develops an ethical care practice that has to be dependent on the relationships that exist in that context. But there are many lessons that people do draw from them that are worth articulating. That things like being responsive to contingency is a sort of fairly fixed ethical, it's a fairly non-contingent type way of describing an ethical principle. Respecting relations, respecting people's interdependency, acknowledging that values shift across time. I sort of think all these are actually quite important ethical principles for the way we care for each other and for the objects that pass through our hands as we care for each other. So I don't see contingency as a threat. I see it as the source of a much richer, nuanced set of ethical ways that people work with each other. And I think you can make policy statements about that.
Thanks, James. That's really reassuring. That we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater as well. So contingency can be part of the whole policy making. Yeah,
and contingency is a really important value because you're recognizing where people are at rather than making assumptions about where people are at.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I mean, just to pick up on that last part, I mean, as you say, contingencies are about relationships, aren't they? You cannot have contingency without recognizing there is some sort of exchange or relationship there. So AKH, I'm afraid I don't know your full name. You've got your hand up, please work away.
Yeah, sorry, my name is Abdul Karim. I'm at LMU in Munich. Prof, my question has to do with the question of issues of ethics in relation to, should I say, geography. Let me give this example. We're talking about care, and I'm talking about ethics. There are some practices that I do in Ghana or in Africa that are my ethical. Because it falls within the Europe, it might be considered unethical. A typical example is the question of gifts. If somebody does something for you and then you go home and go and thank him, they will say, oh, culturally it is okay. But when I do that, maybe in Germany or in England, it might be considered as bribe. So how do I negotiate ethics and care in relation to culture and geography? Thanks.
I suppose, Abdul Karim, thank you very much for your question. I think I'm going to just nod and agree with you to say that ethical contingencies change according to cultural practices, and they shift in context and time and space. And it is therefore very difficult to negotiate, because care doesn't mean care in one context can mean a different thing in a slightly different context. And therefore it's important for each of us to understand the shape and feel and sensation of what care might look like in different places. I say that with also, and that's my wheelbarrows story, because I still know my friends who push their babies in wheelbarrows, in pushchairs. I'm not going to condemn them for that practice. So it's important. It's about thinking about what an understanding of different cultural practices might bring to our understanding of care. I do think there's a point when someone says to me, this is a traditional practice, where you think, well, actually, I see that as violent, or I see that as abusive. And so I think you also have the right to articulate what your understanding of care is within the context you come from. So I don't think certain practices of child rearing are caring. And I feel that we have a right from our particular context to say, I don't think that is caring in that way. That person in that context is looking after that child. And so I think there is contingency, but there's also a position that you have the right to take.
Thank you. Andy.
Thanks, James. I've got sort of a rambling kind of comment question. There's someone who's involved in community arts and obviously sees a lot of care. And also, bringing filmmaking to that, so bringing sort of aesthetics to sort of those situations, and turning community arts into sort of an aesthetic product, maybe. But I had I don't know, in terms of what you're talking about, there was an interesting talk a few weeks ago with Suzanne Lacey and Shannon Jackson about the aestheticization of socially engaged art practice. And it was really interesting because Suzanne Lacey, in a student chat before the main chat, was talking about how her early practice was about the community arts, bringing her aesthetic professional practice based in advertising and publicity to community arts, and using that to promote the activism that she was involved with. But then, I don't know, there was something about Shannon Jackson's talk after it. I don't know whether you saw it, James.
I didn't. I know they're both of their work. So yeah. Yeah.
So there was a slight worry for me in terms of when we talk about aesthetics, we talk about the quality of the aesthetics. And you also mentioned Boreard, and I suppose I always have sort of like you know, in terms of relational aesthetics, if we're thinking about aesthetics and, you know, whether some relationships are more beautiful than others or more valuable. And so, yeah, I'm guessing my rambling question is about you reassuring me that, you know, I'm really interested to read some of this work. It feels like you kind of unpicking some of these things for me, but yeah, I don't know what I'm trying to get at there.
That's fine, Andy.
It's just about that sort of, when we talk about aesthetics, I sort of feel it makes me slightly anxious. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we should be anxious about the term, and it's been, and I'm sort of using it. It's a provocation, clearly, to use it in this area. I think what some people have done in the socially engaged arts is make an assumption that the social is somehow not already got has an aesthetic to it. There's a sort of assumption that there's artists who work in an aesthetic register over on this side, and there is this social sphere, and the social sphere for some people in the comments, sort of some of the writers in this area, see the social sphere as somehow sort of a threat to the aesthetics, and some people in the social sphere see aesthetics as a threat to that. So I suppose my position is trying to say that the social is already aesthetic, and the aesthetic. So there isn't. So that to say that these are two separate spheres, one that's a threat to the other, fails to notice that social practices already have shapes, forms, sensations, craft qualities that can be looked at in terms of their aesthetics. And therefore, it's not, aesthetics isn't, it is about looking at quality, and it is about talking about the ugliness and beauty of certain social processes, whilst accepting that those terms are deeply partial and contingent, but still being brave enough to go, there are forms of NHS care that are stunningly virtuoso beautiful, and there are forms of care that are abusive, and therefore I would argue has a sort of ugliness to them. And I want to use that language to talk about social processes.
Can I come in? Oh, sorry, Anka, I'll pass over to you for your question.
Thank you. This is also not a very fully formed question, and I'm completely new to this context. So thank you, James. I thought that was fascinating, and there's so much to think about. I guess I wanted to ask a little bit more about something you touched on, which is the kind of some of the inequalities that come in around care ethics. And I was interested in thinking about how your work encountered, you know, the idea that certain forms of labor can, from a corporate, let's say, perspective, demand care, you know, so you will, you know, effective labor basically, and that becomes part of what is demanded, but also what then allows the work to be devalued in other forms. How do you negotiate that in your project?
It's a spot-on question, because this work is absolutely in sort of conversation with all the work on effective labor, emotional labor, Hochschild's work. I think so. It really accepts that emotional labor can be a source of oppression, a source that it undermines people, that is poorly paid, and is often for people of color, women workers, migrant workers. So that embedded in many care processes are these sort of classic inequalities. What's really interesting when I've started to do this work is that most of the sociologists working on emotional labor have an assumed negative when they're talking about emotional labor. So it's assumed to be, you know, the work of the classic study on the airline hostesses was that this is a sort of unpleasant or abusive practice potentially. It's interesting reading the social care literature, because a lot of the carers who are interviewed talk about the emotional labor being the only good bit of their job. So it's the emotional labor that gives them the satisfaction, and it's the technical, it's the other bits that they really don't like. So I think what I'm trying to do with care aesthetics is not deny the inequalities, but just focus it's focused directly on those skills that many of the underpaid workers have, and they do value when they talk about it. So it accepts that they're poorly paid, it accepts that it's undervalued, but it's trying to say, let's give it back value by looking at a language to say that those embodied skills that people have are quite extraordinary. They should be higher valued, they should be better paid, it shouldn't be a source of inequality. But many care workers on the lowest pay go, I love working with older people, I love the work I do, I love the relationships I have. I hate the management of it, I hate the structures that mean that I only have 20 minutes to go and care for somebody. But I really value those other bits. So it's trying to capture that, and it's absolutely talk about effective, all those debates about effective labour.
I was just going to say, I think that links really well to Andy's question, actually. It is about who is conferring value and on what terms. So if quality is a value judgment, then who gets to decide what kinds of values? And the fact that it's, you're getting shit pay, but there is an emotional and life affirming value to the social interactions that you're getting through that work, then there's a rebalancing there, and maybe that's what. Jenny, you've got your hand up. Over to you.
Yeah, cheers. So it was a question, I suppose, around within your project, are you kind of going to be mapping the sort of education and training that sits behind kind of the care workers that you're looking at and so on? Because the work that I've been doing on and off with dentistry and also separately with audiology, there's a lot of that is actually around thinking about the skill set and the gaps actually in education and training around thinking about the sensory intimacy, care and carefulness within those relationships. So I just wondered if that kind of education and training bit was all part of the project.
Yeah, there's a main case study which is on the secure dementia wards. Part of the reason our colleague in the NHS Trust who's working with us, she wanted to do those particular wards because they have a lot of what the NHS has different phrases for them, but they call them unqualified healthcare, or so they're sort of healthcare assistants, occupational therapy assistants. So members of staff who don't have professional qualifications, but bear the brunt of all the work on those wards. And it's on a secure dementia ward. That means people who are there because of the Mental Health Act. It's really difficult work, and so the reason they want us to focus on that area is because the double thing of that, the staff who are doing the majority of the work are undervalued, but also the training is really close to non-existent. Well, there is training, of course, but there isn't any formalized training. There isn't much language for the training that OTAs, healthcare assistants get. So absolutely, our project hopes to be thinking about what sort of training and what sort of register and what sort of language and what sort of practice that we might be looking at. And always trying to acknowledge that those healthcare assistants, occupational therapy assistants, actually also cleaners, anyone who's working on the ward who are all doing care work, they have a skill set, and often they have a very high level of I would say care aesthetic skill sets, but it's not formalized, it's not discussed. And so I think you're absolutely right. Yes, it will become part of the project as it develops.
Thank you. Can I ask a practical question more around the research as well, James? I was interested to hear about, you kind of mentioned a couple of potential areas of art or social practice that you're going to draw, or that you potentially might draw on, and I wondered if it's related to the the commissioning case study that they do, major commission in care setting. But I think my question is, and I think you mentioned like theatre devising and.
Oh, I've lost you, Abby.
Oh, internet.
Say that again. You're back.
Okay, great. I'll ask my question a bit more quicker then. It's the art historical question actually, and it's about whether you are going to, whether there is, or whether people have done this already actually, enough for you not to do it, but whether there is going to be a mining of understanding of representations of care and the aesthetics of care, not necessarily just in visual arts form, but also, you know, in literature and so on. How does the project connect with work in that area?
Yeah, there's one of the first stages of the project, so this year really, is those sort of, it's the sort of detailed literature reviews to look at the whole field of socially engaged arts, really broadly defined, and how it's encountered care. Sometimes that is the sites in which it's operated, so care homes, working with young people in care homes, working with young people who've left care. So the word care appears in a whole range of our socially engaged arts practices. So there will be a research on contexts of care, but also places where care ethics or a sense of care has been articulated through a project. But then we're also going to do interviews with contemporary socially engaged art practitioners or companies to see where they do engage with care ethics, or where when you do engage them with care ethics, how that makes them reflect on their practice. So there is a sort of digging bit, and there's also an encounter bit where we will interview someone who's a socially engaged arts practitioner and say, have you ever thought about care? And tons of them have, and some of them just don't use that as a register. And when they do, it's quite interesting. So yeah, my answer is, that's a long way of saying yes.
Yeah, although in social practice, rather than perhaps more traditional visual art forms and
yeah,
representative forms.
Well, there is got to be a piece of work in this that's around, there's two bits of work that's probably missing in this project, because I'm a theatre person, so obviously I have an emphasis on theatre and participatory practice in that area. There is so much work in museums and object care and the literature around object care, that we would be amiss if that didn't inform what we're doing. And so that we will intersect with that, but I also don't want to just say, oh, that just jumps into the pot and is part of the big mix, because I think there's a very particular tradition of object care which is fantastic for this, which will help inform this project.
Yeah, the very word curation. Andy, I think you're going to jump in here with perhaps something that might help.
Well, I was just thinking, James, you know, one thing, you know, with the culture kind of health and well-being culture kind of crossover, I don't think you mentioned it as part of the project, but was social prescribing, just and I just wondered why. And then as you were talking then, I was thinking I'm involved at Platt Hall at the moment, and in terms of collection care, they are using the Robert Derbyshire practice prescribes working at Platt Hall and working with objects as, yeah, why not social prescribing, I suppose, is the question.
I suppose one thing I'm trying, social prescribing absolutely could become part of this, so I have no doubt that it is part of the picture. I've tried, what we're trying to do is slightly move away from an arts and health model, because that maintains the sense that there's health over here and there's arts, and the arts goes in, or the health to say that there are aesthetic caring practices which we should enhance. Sometimes it's done by a potter, and sometimes it's done by a physio, and sometimes it's done by a choreographer, and sometimes it's done by a curator, and sometimes it's done by a nurse. And I want to think about how they intersect, interrelate, rather than saying that one brings that resource to another. So the prescribing model is, you need art, or that balm is what you need. And that, as sort of, even though I think there's amazing socially prescribed practices, trying to slightly question that sense that it is a barn.
Yeah, that makes loads of sense. I was just kind of like wondering where it fitted in, because
Yeah.
it kind of seems to be coming from the other angle as well. I don't know what I'm trying to say there, but yeah, thanks.
And I guess it's impossible to do everything in one short project. We're coming up to time. I don't know if anyone had any final comments or questions for James before we let him slip away into the evening.
No.
Okay, we are sated for now. Thank you so much for your time and for that beautiful articulation of both the impetus for the work, but also, you know, we hope to see roll out over the, how long is the project? 2 years, is it?
3 years.
3 years, okay, great. So some breathing space to do this. And of course, yeah, do come back to us if you can, or send us your research and tell us more as it progresses. And yeah, if there are any areas of work that it would be useful to have a further conversation on in terms of the things we've been talking about this.
Yeah. Thanks so much, and thanks everyone. It's really great to see you all. The intersection of this project and people who work on object care, I would love if there's people within art history or people working in museum studies who have that sort of specialism. I'd love to engage on those areas in particular, because I think there's a real conversation to develop around the care aesthetics around objects, people's relation to objects, and a sort of non-human part of this.
Okay.
Can I just say, James, that in Salk there's the Affective Artifacts Collective, and so I can send you the link to that. And it's loads of people across Salk who work on material culture. So
that'd be great.
Great.
Thanks ever so much.
All right, well, thanks everyone. Let's call it to a close. Thanks for your brilliant questions and comments as well. And yeah, have a good and careful evening.
Thank you.
See you soon.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, James.